I guess we should start. So I want to welcome everybody. I'm Jerry Singerman. I'm the Senior Humanities Editor at the University of Pennsylvania Press. And I would like to welcome everybody to this, the first regular panel of the 2020 annual meeting of the Medieval Academy of America. Or I should probably say the first irregular panel. Wherever you are, I know like me, you would much rather be in Berkeley at this moment. And I want to thank Catherine O'Brien O'Keefe, Maureen Miller, and their entire local organizing committee for the years of work they put into planning what would surely have been a truly extraordinary conference. We all share your disappointment in its cancellation, even as we recognize that our own disappointment probably can't hold a candle up to yours. But we thank you, as well as the staff of the Medieval Academy, Lisa Fagan-Davis, Chris Cole, and others, today in particular for making this compressed version of the conference possible. I'd also like to thank Fiona Griffiths, who organized this session, but most of all, of course, I want to thank Ruth Mazo Karras, whose contributions to the fields of medieval history and the history of gender and sexuality have so enriched us intellectually, and whose professionalism, respectful collegiality, intellectual and personal generosity, and yes, extraordinary range and intelligence have set models we can only hope to emulate. I've been tremendously fortunate in a career that has allowed me to work closely with Ruth over the course of the past 25 years, during which time she served as the editor of Penn's Middle Ages series, and I might add, has also published 4 single-authored or co-authored books with the press, with a 5th currently in preparation. I consider myself tremendously fortunate as well in counting Ruth among my friends. But on to the papers. I will introduce our speakers separately, and while I'm afraid that we won't be able to take questions and answers directly from the audience, I do welcome anybody who would like to put forth a question to email me, and I can make a selection of things at the end. My email address is my last name without the last letter, so it's Singerma, S-I-N-G-E-R-M-A, @upenn.edu, and I'll be checking for emails throughout the talks. I also, of course, encourage the panelists to respond to one another's papers with any thoughts or questions they have, and I encourage everybody in their conversations and in their emails to respect the rules of professional behavior that the Academy has put forward. Okay, our first speaker is Lynda Kuhn, who is Professor of History in the J. William Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences of the University of Arkansas and Dean of the Honors College at the university. Her research focuses on the history of Christianity from circa 300 to 900 of the Common Era. Her book, Sacred Fictions, Holy Women and Hagiography in Late Antiquity, published by Penn in 1997, explored the sacred biographies of late antique women saints. Her 2010 Dark Age Bodies, Gender and Monastic Practice in the Early Medieval West, also with Penn, focused on the ritual, spatial, and gendered worlds of monks in the Carolingian period. She has supervised doctoral dissertations on the cult of the Archangel Michael in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, gendering the late ancient basilicas of Rome, and the culture of letter writing among the Cappadocian Fathers. Her paper today is drawn from her current book project on the imagining of Jesus in the Dark Ages, and indeed the Dark Ages is Lynda's own preferred designation for the period she studies. So Lynda, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Jerry. I'm going to try the technology here, sharing my screen. Let's see if I can get the right screen. Let's see here. I think it's this one. Can you see the first slide?
Coronavirus.
Thank you. That's it. All right.
I just taught a course on pandemics.
Perfect. All right. I am very honored to be part of a panel celebrating Ruth Mazo Karras, whose career has been inspirational to those of us working in gender and sexuality studies, and whose research has problematized the divide between the pre-modern and the modern. So that was a wonderful plenary today, Ruth, and super, I think it sets up what I'm about to say pretty well for a variety of different reasons. So we'll see if you agree. Onwards to this adventure in medieval cyberspace, where Dark Age Jesus appears in salt, consecrated by Carolingian priests. So here we go. In Book 12 of the Odyssey, the wanderer from Ithaca and his fellow mariners encounter seductive sirens, bird women with talons. In one of the most famous scenes in the epic, the companions of Odysseus escape destruction by having their ears sealed with beeswax, while their commander is lashed to the mast and writhes in agony or ecstasy at the call of the sirens, who apparently flutter above his storm-tossed galley. Similar Greco-Roman sirens infiltrated the writings of Hebrew prophets, translated into the Greek of the Septuagint. In that text, sirens join other wild beasts in the ruins of cities destroyed by God's wrath. They threaten the Israelites in the wilderness, and they haunt biblical wastelands with their bewitching chant. Almost 600 years later, St. Jerome praises the children of Israel who stopped their ears, Odysseus-like, when attacked by noontime demons. Oblivious to the enchanted voices, God's chosen shut out the siren song, using their most precious treasure, their faith, to guard their hearts. In 8th century manuscripts, however, the Homeric bird women have been transformed into faith-threatening mermaids. Their realm is the sea, not the sky or sandy ruins. The Sacramentary of Cologne includes some of the most famous such figures in the history of illuminated texts. The Cologne Sacramentary launches the liturgical year with vigils held for Christ's birth. The artist of the Cologne frames these Christmas Eve rites with 2 striking females. On the top left, the Blessed Virgin Mary initiates the vigil for Jesus's momentous birth to come. Vertical and elongated, she dominates the page. Her identity is sealed by the inscription on both sides of her head, Sancta Maria. To the Virgin's left, a fishwoman is swimming toward her against the tide of Latin letters, slanting across the page from left to right. In contrast to the Virgin, the mermaid is horizontal, her tail coiled. She draws the viewer's eye toward her body because of its prominent position at the top center of the page, as well as because of her hybrid style, fusing fish with woman. The fishwoman is nameless, allowing the viewer of the manuscript to ponder her meaning within the theater of the liturgy delineated by the Latin text of the Sacramentary. These 2 female figures, the Virgin and the mermaid, confront one another visually in a way that is truly singular in Carolingian manuscripts. In fact, the image of the Virgin itself innovates in the iconographical history of the early medieval era. She wears a pectoral cross, emblematic of her high ecclesiastical status. She swings a censer with her right hand, a priestly object drawn in the same gold with red outline as the Virgin herself. Mary's left hand holds a red cross, which appears to be in motion, as if about to hit the head of the fishwoman below. The cross's downward thrust is kinetic, as shown by the tumbling Chi-Rho symbol, sitting atop the sacred abbreviation for Jesus's name. In anticipation of the incarnation, this Chi-Rho at the far right of the line points back towards the Virgin's body. Its partner Chi-Rho on the opposite page tilts slightly to the right, bidding the reader to enter fully into the sacramentary to see how the story of the incarnation unfolds. The Virgin, who holds the incarnate Christ in her womb, stands on tiptoes on a column-like eye, which forms the first letter of the word incipit. The image expresses various functions, testifying to the beginning of the book, to Christ as the Logos at creation, and to Mary's role as gestational vessel for the Word made flesh. At the bottom of the column, a serpentine creature with a horse-like head can be seen, devouring green vegetation. The green shade points us back to the aquatic woman, whose hair takes the form of grassy seaweed and whose tail is powered by wavy, mossy material, parallel to the fish forming the letter D of Domini below her. The mermaid sports egg-shaped scales in green, a feature indicative of her salty fecundity, for she is Venus's spawn. Green also links the mermaid to other images on the page, save Mary, who lacks verdant hues. Mary raises her feet atop a gold column capital, thereby avoiding contact with the leafy material below. Unlike Mary, the mermaid lacks arms and hands, signifiers of priestly power and purity in the Carolingian worlds. At the point where the fishwoman's pudenda should be placed, there is instead a knot midway down her torso. Therefore, the mermaid's feminine form is every bit as mysterious and hidden as that of the tightly clad rectilinear virgin. Both women hold the promise of fertility out to the viewer. The mermaid in the form of egg-like scales, the virgin in the guise of the censer, which signal to Carolingian churchmen Christ's body suffused with a pleasing odor. While Christ is not visualized in this opening folio, the censer stands in for his body. This confrontation between virgin and mermaid is far from whimsical. The two female characters set the ritual theater for the entire sacramentary. The Cologne Sacramentary stages a riveting struggle over terrestrial, oceanic, and cosmological fertility. In the sacramentary, Mary and her virginal troops channel celestial fertility, while the mermaid and her minions produce sterile seed. The prototype for these two styles of fecundity can be found in the Torahs signifying a righteousness, the Torah that is, the quality of being upright, and its opposite, crooked or twisted. The virgin is an upright column, an axis mundi. Her womb, a holy temple enshrining Christ. The mermaid wallows in sin horizontally with a twisted tail. Armless, she slithers through the pages. She is a gateway to destruction and temptation, luring readers away from the sacred script and into unfruitful sensuality. Her womb is fettered by sterility. The mermaid is Eve fallen from grace. The virgin is the second Eve whose chastity conquers the labile state of her forebear. Mary's strongest cohort within the Cologne Sacramentary are the male altar servants of the Carolingian world. This virgin's priestly activities visualized in the opening folio, thrusting a handheld cross downwards to expel evil and clasping a fragrant censer to purify, bring to life the ceremonies detailed in the sacramentary and performed by bishops, priests, and deacons. Frankish priests are the virgin's successors within the theater of the Mass, where they arbitrate the fertility of women's wombs with Mary as a heavenly guide. At the same time, churchmen usurp, through ritual means, the ability of women to reproduce. In rites of exorcism, baptism, and blessings, clerics miraculously open and close wombs in imitation of God. They also transfer the procreative power of the womb to the consecrated objects they use, especially salt, and they do so by ritually activating them. While Mary in priestly garb is evocative of Carolingian churchmen, her nemesis, mermaid as siren, encapsulates the negative forces of the universe that are hostile to ecclesiastical ritual. The mermaid's presence in Christian manuscripts and medieval works of art signifies the dark side of human behavior, sexual depravity, earthly temptation, and satanic compulsion. She and her demonic legions infect bodies, objects, and waters. The fishwoman causes earthly wombs to close, crops to fail, contaminants to pollute water, and weather to turn foul, all subjects dealt with in the sacramentary. Significantly, the mermaid's ties to salt and water, two elements used in the Mass to exorcise, consecrate, and baptize, bring her perilously close to the world of male altar servants, who rebirth Christians through the procreative waters of baptism, purified and made productive by salt. This ritual of regeneration finds its biblical origins in the figure of the prophet Elisha, who throws salt into noxious waters, transforming them into a life-giving, fertile spring. Although startling to contemporary readers, the inclusion of mermaids in early medieval religious texts is not unknown. The Book of Kells displays an image of a mermaid looking to the viewer. She has a knotted midzone and unnaturally long folded arms with elegant flipper-like fingers. She fills the empty space at the end of a gospel verse. Like the fish woman on folio 1V of the Cologne Sacramentary, the Kells mermaid backstrokes against the surge formed by the left to right flow of letters in the text. In the Carolingian Stuttgart Psalter, Christ calms the storm at sea, as if an exorcism aimed at a merman blasting his horn amidst sea creatures, presumably responsible for the demonic weather. The Psalter includes more maritime monsters, underscoring God's supremacy over creation as detailed in the Psalms. His is the sea, he made it. Yonder is the great sea, wide, creeping things innumerable are there. There go the ships and Leviathan that you formed to sport in it. Carolingian fishermen tangle with the monstrous male Draco, yet another nautical danger. In yet another Carolingian Psalter, a seductive mermaid appears in the margin between the Latin text of two Psalms. Her body forms the D of the opening verb of the Psalm 13, Dixit. She has bare breast and she trails her hair through an elaborate headdress while gazing at the audience of the Psalter. Her exposed midriff elides into an elaborate tail decorated with geometric patterns, scales, and pincers at the end. In her right hand, she grasps a plait of hair along with the curved end of a banner reading, quote, "The voice of the church against the Jewish people who deny that Christ is God," end quote. The mermaid's body is sandwiched in between the prayer of a pious petitioner entreating God's favor in Psalm 12 and Psalm 13, a castigation of evildoers who fail to invoke the eternal. The Carolingian artist thus interprets the foolish man of Psalm 13, who, quote, believes there is no God, as an allegory of the apostasy of the Jewish people and their rejection of the Christ. The mermaid's grotesque body pushes up against the Latin words for corrupt and abomination, accentuating her role in the story of salvation as a temptress, seizing the impious with snapping claws. This fishwoman is the most dreadful hybrid, with a human torso arrayed with fins, scales, and pincers. The latter personify the perpetually unclean bottom feeder, an anti-Semitic slur hurled at Jews by biblical exegetes in the Carolingian West. Despite early medieval anxieties about the maritime world, Carolingian poets and churchmen fondly connected the Blessed Virgin Mary with the sea. Alcuin of York, most notably, had a strong devotion to the Virgin. Alcuin uses the phrase "star of the sea" frequently in his poetry, anticipating a Carolingian predilection for the salt-soaked Virgin. The image of Mary in the Cologne visualizes several verses of the Stella Maris. The anonymous poem celebrates the Virgin as a blessed gate of heaven, a nurturing mother of God, and a transformer of Eve's name. These verses are in dialogue with the priestly image of the Cologne Mary, as well as with the rites described in the Codex. The Virgin's position on a column with her feet barely touching its top points to her role as celestial mediator, gateway to heaven, and second Eve, who overturns the fallen nature of her namesake, the mermaid, through militant chastity. The Virgin also is an exorcist or dispeller of evil, the fishwoman, and she is a receptacle for the petitions to Christ made by the people described in the Sacramentary. As a star, she enlightens and illuminates the righteous path for the Christians of the Carolingian Empire, a journey conducted through the rituals delineated in the Sacramentary. The Virgin, as star of the sea, is the pole star of the Cologne Sacramentary, guiding the Frankish Church to Christ with male altar servants as ferrymen. The sea and its connection to the Virgin and the mermaid appears in ritual and exegetical contexts in the Cologne Sacramentary. Salt and water are two elements used by the priest to activate objects, humans, and even demons. Some of these rites relate to fertility, and the most intense rituals center on baptism. Baptismal ceremonies are examples of fructificatio, or the ways in which the Christian liturgy produces space for begetting and birthing. These baptismal rites also stage a drama where Carolingian altar servants assume the creative power of God in Genesis and the deity's conquest of the deep. Baptismal scrutinies in the Cologne Sacramentary begin during Lent and differ for males and females. In the first scrutiny, an acolyte inscribes the names of those to be baptized on a document held in the church. He then calls the candidates, or electi, into the church, male infants on the right and females on the left, presumably carried in by family members. The deacon prays over them and a priest performs the ancient exorcism of salt, an element used in baptismal rites. One by one, the priest states the names of the electi and places salt in their mouths. The acolyte then lays hands on the electi and exorcises them 3 times. In the first exorcism, the acolyte recites the names of Hebrew patriarchs and the children of Israel liberated from Egypt over the male electi. Female bodies receive a different sort of lineage: God of heavens and earth, angels, archangels, prophets, martyrs, virgins. The juxtaposition of male patriarchs who, according to Genesis, will have seed as numerous as the stars, with a chain of genderless or inviolate beings, points to separate baptismal ceremonies for males and females and their encoded message about terrestrial and spiritual fecundity. The climax of these rites of passage centers on the baptismal font, the spiritual nexus of this early medieval cosmology. In this ritual, the bishop accompanies the congregation into the basilica, along with 2 clerics elevating 2 candles and bearing both censers and bells. Interestingly, bells themselves are subject to liturgical rites in the Cologne Sacramentary, including censing, rubbing with salt and oil, and washing with water, ritual actions parallel to those experienced by baptized bodies. For humans, the congregation witnessing baptism encircles the font with more lights. The bishop intones prayers, blessing the font and explicating the mysteries of its vivifying water and its role as a uterus, rebirthing humans into a celestial state. Thereafter, he signs the water. In so doing, he both exorcises the water and conjures the 4 rivers of paradise, a cosmological act. The bishop emulates the power of God to separate out dry land from the waters, a testimony to the eternal subjugation of the chaotic forces of the sea, the conquest of Leviathan, the twisting serpent of Isaiah, and Jesus treading over vanquished waves. At this point in the ceremony, an acolyte thrusts 2 candles into the font, summoning the potency or virtus of the Holy Spirit to make fecund the waters. The candles call to mind the 2 great lights created by God to rule over night and day, as well as the dual nature of Jesus. Once they make the prodigious plunge, the tapers remain burning for the duration of the ceremony. The candles clearly represent the divine phallus impregnating the font through the agency of male altar servants, a fertility rite delineated in the Latin text of the Sacramentary. The culmination of baptism thus is the spilling of priestly semen, i.e. the consecrated salt, into the church's uterus, the font. The baptismal font, an integral player in the story of the Cologne Sacramentary, enables Carolingian priests to emulate the Torah's depiction of God as an opener and closer of women's wombs. In the Torah, a disembodied God uses the divine voice to impregnate sterile women. In the Gospels, the Holy Spirit does the work of semen, filling the barren womb of Mary with God's Son. The Sacramentary plays off biblical passages centered on tensions between terrestrial sterility and celestial fecundity. Nowhere is this friction more perceptible than in the Mass held on behalf of sterile women, a rite juxtaposed with the prayers given after successful birth. The first oration on the birth of a child resonates with the opening page of the Sacramentary. The infant is taken from its mother's viscera and birthed into the world, just as Mary experiences the same process to yield the word. In the liturgy targeted at the empire's infertile wombs, priests invoke the biblical example of Sarah, whose dead vulva wondrously resurrects to receive fertile seed activated by the divine voice. The sacramentary then lists a chain of sterile matriarchs who give birth miraculously: Rebecca, Rachel, Elizabeth. Carolingian altar servants take on the power of God's voice, making fertile a uterus tormented by fetters of sterility, the liturgical speech for barren wombs. An illustration of a woman frames these prayers directed at dead wombs. The image may possibly be Sarah of Genesis, as she existed in the Carolingian imaginary, an exotic figure with large dangling earrings and a betrothed headdress. Along with the curved fish, this female figure forms the D of Deus. Her green gloved hand gestures toward the beginning of the oration for sterile women. Green also points to the fertile future of the shackled uterus once it is freed by a priest. The gesture made by the woman's green gloves also points to the next prayers in the sacramentary, which are designed to make verdant barren terrain through abundant rain, sunny weather, and ample crops. Clearly, the fertility of the female body relates directly to the abundance of agricultural produce. Sterility of bodies and infertility of plants are both the result of demonic incursions, the spirit's sphere of influence, the siren spirit of influence. Green also recalls the opening folio with its showdown between mermaid and virgin. The siren exists as an index for the abundant evils portrayed in the sacramentary. The siren merman's legions blight the fruit of the earth, just as they constrict the uterus, rendering it barren. The mermaid extends her reach from the depths of the sea up into water sources of the earth, wells and founts. Her reign over the salty sea abuts the priestly zone in the theater of the mass, where salt and water, the mermaid's elemental forces, come under the control of male altar servants. She is the ancient servant, the wicked devil, the wicked dragon, the ultimate adversary in the sacramentary. The siren's twisted yet alluring body warns Christians, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. The Cologne Sacramentary and its priestly pole star, the Virgin Mary, demonstrates that the straight path to the heavens must be accessed through rituals that conquer the satanic sway of the siren and her minions. But the Virgin's victory over the mermaid may merely be a Pyrrhic one. Because the siren represents the forces of the universe in conflict with the church, there may be an alternative way of interpreting the sacramentary. The siren's insouciant gaze at the viewer of the manuscript is an obvious challenge to the male priests and to those who obey their liturgical commands. The siren unleashes a maritime regiment marshaled strategically throughout the sacramentary. Her body forms the VD of the Veredignum, the famous prayer of Holy Thursday. Her scaly minions appear in multiple forms, the ultimate shape changers of the Codex. Most often, they comprise the D of the Latin word for God, Deo, Deus. They swim across folia in myriad other forms, a crucifixion like E, a serpentine S, and a bizarre dragon snake hybrid with a darting tongue licking an O. On the one hand, these aquatic beasts, biting and snapping, resonate with the early medieval symbol for Christ, ichthus, or fish. On the other hand, they point to the clash between the elements, especially salt and water, and the priest attempting to control them through rituals of baptism and exorcism. These seemingly marginal images thus carry meaning rather than functioning only as trifling, fancy-driven ornamentations, leavings of an illuminator nodding over his task. Specifically, the reptilian letters signify the siren's foothold in the manuscript, as in the human heart. The siren herself is described in religious tracts from late antiquity through the early medieval period as a seducer, demon of the noontime, enchantress, venomous serpent, gateway to hell. The maritime features of the sacramentary evoke the shadowy world, the rival, chthonic cults, fertility, magic, and even enterprising commerce with infernal spirits. The misogyny of the Cologne Sacramentary is imprinted in the siren's Neptunian comrades and their associations with fertility and magic. While not as acrobatic or sensual as the fish women of the Camino de Santiago from the Romanesque period, the siren of the Galon awakens that ancient misogynistic trinity of fish, vulva, and salty fecundity. While lacking the exhibitionist vulva of the sculpted bifid mermaid you see on the screen, the siren on the Carolingian Psalter between Psalm 12 and 13 aims her pincers toward her midzone, a gesture reminding the viewer of the dangers of entering into the female because of her ambition to trawl men to the chasm of carnality. The association between vagina and monstrous mouth appears in the Stuttgart Psalter's visualization of Jonah being swallowed by a maritime monster, viewed by a sea woman blowing a trumpet. The elements of Carolingian culture considered here have left a large footprint in the history of the West, especially regarding the negative priestly portrayal of women as practitioners of dark arts, employing their bodies as gateways to Satan. Vestiges of this battle over fecundity are still felt in the liturgy of today, where priests continue to perform their conquest of the waters through the plunge of candles into the baptismal font. Yet the present is witnessing a transformation in religious practice and perspective more in line with the elemental powers of the siren and her maritime allies. Reading the headlines of major news venues brings home this point. Millennials reject Christianity, witchcraft on the rise, the return of paganism. Esoteric beliefs maintain their appeal even in the era of the smartphone, attested to by the numerous tarot, astrology, and ghost hunting apps available to the public. Indeed, those consumers now exist in a world where a positive link between feminist and witch has made its way into mainstream culture, where Christianity is apparently losing its hegemony in the West, and where the mermaid of the Cologne Sacramentary may come to stand for the futility of established male-centered religion to address fully human needs. Beyond the relevance of this topic to the contemporary scene, scholars probably should reconsider the study of the liturgy and its priestly actors, certainly dismissing images like the medieval siren just as enchantingly quirky, or making them try desperately to fit Christian patterns of worship, or ignoring them altogether. It's a good idea for historians to recognize that these Dark Age mermaids memorialize the possibility of spiritual roots, other spiritual roots taken by medieval pilgrims, but in whose presence in the historical narrative has largely been invisible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynda. And give me just 1 second. Okay, I'm back. And our second speaker is Dyan Elliott, the Peter B. Ritzma Professor in the Humanities at the Department of History at Northwestern University. Dyan has spent her career analyzing church history through the shifting lenses of gender, sexuality, spirituality, and the ongoing tensions between orthodoxy and religious dissent. Her publications include Spiritual Marriage, Sexual Abstinence in Medieval Wedlock, published by Princeton in 1992, Fallen Bodies, Pollution, Sexuality, and Demonology in the Middle Ages, Penn, 1999, Proving Women, Female Mysticism and Inquisitional Practice in Late Medieval Europe. She went back to Princeton in 2004 for that, and also won the Otto Grundler Award for Outstanding Contribution to Medieval Studies. Followed by The Bride of Christ Goes to Hell, Metaphor and Embodiment in the Lives of Pious Women, 200 to 1500, coming back to Penn for that in 2012. Her Corrupter of Boys, Sodomy, Scandal, and the Medieval Clergy, forthcoming from Penn this fall, explores how the medieval church's scandal-averse policies paved the way for the modern church's sexual abuse crisis. She's also the author of a somewhat racy yet exquisitely researched novel about the Cathars, A Hole in the Heavens, published in 2017. Her paper today is titled The Monastic Culture of Sodomy, and it's a pleasure to welcome Dyan.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm sorry about all that back and forth with Princeton. So
you came back to Penn, it's okay. Yeah.
Right. I just want to say what an honor it is, first, to be introduced by you, in a session for our beloved Ruth. And, you know, I'm honored to honor Ruth. And she's one of my oldest friends in academia. I'm not going to tell you how old, but, and I admire her work very much. And I hope she admires mine, because she's always the person who I first asked to read it. So without further ado, oh, I also want to say how glad I am to be on a panel with Lynda Kuhn, and you'll see from my paper how indebted I am to her wonderful book, Dark Age Bodies. So I don't have any pictures. You're just going to, you can blank me if you want. Okay. Okay. Monastic culture of sodomy. Decades ago, Philippe Ariès argued that the pre-modern period had no conception of childhood. This position has been roundly rebuffed by historians, and rightly so. I would contend, however, that the medieval view of childhood was much darker than most medievalists are willing to accept. This paper explores aspects of this dark side as it appears in monastic culture and the toleration of sexual abuse of minors, which I see as a side effect of clerical celibacy. It argues that monastic pederasty was already established as a tacit norm in ascetical circles of the early church and would remain so throughout the Middle Ages. The first monks were anchorites who peopled the Egyptian and Syrian deserts. At a time when a married clergy was still licit, the Desert Fathers distinguished themselves by their unique commitment to chastity, which was frequently enacted through an avoidance of women that bordered on fanatical. This did not just mean shunning physical proximity to women. Authorities like Cajun believed that the devil used memories of women to gain access to the mind of a monk, a process that might begin innocuously enough with reminiscences about one's mother, but then escalate. All memories of women must therefore be cast out. The physical avoidance and mental suppression of women left a void, and this void was filled by boys. There was a fluidity between boys and women in desert culture that did not require explicit articulation, nor was there a heightened opprobrium for succumbing sexually to one over the other. The very rigor of the Desert Fathers' sexual discipline had a blunting effect. With no legitimate sexual outlets, degrees of sinfulness became muted. As a result, when it came to fornication, women, boys, and even donkeys were, for all practical purposes, on an equal footing. This lack of differentiation between the temptations afforded by women and boys alike is exemplified in the terms in which the legendary Paphnutius turned away a youthful monk from the community. And he said, "I do not allow the face of a woman to dwell in Scatus," which is an eremitical valley in Egypt, "because of the conflict with the enemy," end of quote. The assumption that boys are an unequivocal danger to all ascetics is amply represented through many terse epigraphs scattered throughout the Vita Patrum. Quote, "He who gorges himself and talks with a boy has already in his thought committed fornication with him." Quote, "When you see a cell built close to a marsh, know that the devastation of Scatus is near. When you see trees, know that it is at the doors. And when you see young children, take up your sheepskins and go away." Quote, "Be aware of your faults. Do not judge others, but put yourself below everyone. Do not be friendly with a boy, nor with a heretical friend." Quote, "A man who lives with a boy and is incited by him to no matter what passions of the old man, and yet keeps him with him, that man is like someone who has a field which is eaten up by maggots." The ubiquity of such sentiments had the effect of normalizing boys as a source of sexual temptation in ascetical discourse. It is significant that while St. Anthony triumphed over a demon in female form, the spirit of fornication appeared before him as a black child who was described as horrid. The demon was presumably described as horridus, for his success in inspiring lust in holy men, an achievement he trumpeted with glee. Although John Chrysostom idealized the monastery as providing a bulwark to safeguard the young boy's chastity, V.A. Colvey's assessment is probably more realistic. Quote, "Cenobitic monasticism, the Middle Ages' highest ideal of the religious life, almost against its will, created the most fertile field imaginable in which same-sex desire might grow, while prescribing and punishing its physical expression. In contrast to the child-rejecting stance of the Desert Fathers, Canobitic monasteries welcomed children who could be dedicated as child oblates. Oh, by the way, I've ended the quote. As child oblates while still in their infancy. As Lynda Kuhn has demonstrated in her wonderful Dark Age Bodies, the boys, although fledgling members of the community, continue to be assimilated with women and are therefore seen as a source of temptation and hence active corruption. The child oblate's vulnerability to sexual predation looms large in monastic commentaries. Although Benedict's rule contains no discussion of sexual infractions, there is a section regarding the punishment of certain graver sins that the saint once again discreetly refrained from naming. While admiring Benedict's discretion, Hildemar, the Carolingian commentator on the rule, did not seek to emulate it. In his discussion of the graver sins, Hildemar specifies, quote, if a brother from his 15th year onward should seize a small boy and commit fornication with that child, the child should be beaten with rods and chastised for this, end of quote. In contrast, the assailant, if a first-time offender, is given a light penance, especially if he's drunk at the time. Despite its presence among the graver faults, this kind of assault is only treated as such when it is a repeat offense. And repeat offense, it says 2 or 3 times, in which case that individual is barred from the priesthood. If the repeat offender is already ordained, however, he must refrain from saying Mass for 2 years. And for anybody who's interested in Hildemar, I've got to direct you to Lynda Kuhn's wonderful Hildemar project, which is online and has translated, I think, practically all of the commentary at this point. It is difficult to untangle the reasoning for why a sexually abused child should receive harsher punishment than his assailant. I can only offer some possible rationales, none of which is mutually exclusive. One possibility involves Old Testament law, which requires that both males involved in sexual relations be punished by death. That's in Leviticus. But Bernadette Bruton has argued that the ancient Jews were more inclined to regard the younger passive party as deserving of death and to let the elder party go free. The reasoning is that the active party, at least, quote, remain culturally masculine. Perhaps a similar mentality prevailed in all male communities. Another option would be the dissonance between a child who had been sullied by abuse and the purity that he was meant to represent. By the Carolingian period, the child oblate had become associated with Samuel, who was offered to the temple as an infant and was understood as both a living sacrifice and a model for the priest or bishop growing up in the church. Perhaps stripped of his innocence, the oblate was no longer considered a worthy offering to God, nor, corrupted at an early age, was he a prime candidate for the priesthood. Whether or not the boy was in some way complicit with his assailant was seemingly incidental. The pollution of the child himself might be compounded by the question of his assailant's possible ordination. Not only has the child lost his value as an offering, but his seductive presence may have compromised an otherwise promising candidate for the priesthood. A final hypothesis involves the possible persistence of antique theories regarding the etiology of same-sex desire. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics divided males who desired males into 2 groups, those who were made this way by nature and those who became that way by habit. The latter group consists of those abused in childhood. The punishment that the abused child received might be precautionary, reflecting the fear that this early violation might condition him to seek out in parallel encounters. This final option is supported by Hildemar's comment that if the child lives, quote, an honest life, by which he means specifically, quote, never falls into this sin again, he may still accede to the honor of the priesthood. I know this looks like scotch, but it's iced tea. But whatever the rationale, such a judgment was not peculiar to Hildemar. We find parallel judgments in a number of penitentials, a genre reflected of the early monastic milieu. Apart from the insistence on punishing boy victims of monastic rape, it is significant that the various indictments of monastic sodomy are generally impervious to the question of age. It was simply accepted that same-sex relations in religious communities would follow the antique model of pederasty. The heinousness of the act almost invariably trumps questions of age. Almost invariably, but not always. The Visigothic rule of Saint Fructuosus of Braga, 7th century, which insists that any monk who seduces children or youths or is apprehended in a kiss or gazing longingly or any other filthy scenario should have his tonsure removed, be publicly beaten, spit upon, and then imprisoned in chains. We also find rare protestations within the Benedictine tradition. The 10th century Odo of Cluny laments that a boy given as a pure offering like Samuel should be corrupted, quote, by someone whom Satan inflamed. But these are exceptions. Even Peter Damian's Book of Gomorrah does not raise the specter of age. Instead, his moral outrage was leveled against the corruption of sacraments, turning on the spiritual affinity that arises between the bishop and the priest he ordains. In short, the preoccupation with the heinousness of the offense versus the situation and age of the victim meant that the child oblate, that indiscreet object of desire, must be constrained for the good of the community. In the Cluniac constitutions of Lanfranc, written in 1077 for the monastery attached to the cathedral in Canterbury, the isolation of the oblate is truly wrenching. Quote, when reading, they shall sit apart from one another in such a way that no one can touch his neighbor, either with his hands or his clothes. No child shall make a sign to another, nor say a word to him, unless the master can see and hear him. Whithersoever the children go, a master will be between every two. When the abbot is present in choir, no one shall strike a child or cause him to strip for flogging, unless the abbot so orders. When the abbot is away, the cantor may beat them for their faults in performance that fall under his jurisdiction. In all other small matters, the prior shall punish them. Wherever they may be, no one, save the persons mentioned above, shall make a sign to them or smile at them. No one shall ever enter their school or speak to them anywhere unless permission has been granted, end of quote. That is the formal side of the monastic discourse on children. The informal side often presents monastic pederasty as more a source of humor than outrage. Cloistered sex with a minor takes on an especially ribald turn under the direction of Walter Map, a secular cleric at the court of Henry II and an outspoken critic of monastic culture. Map relates how a visiting Cistercian abbot was musing aloud while at table over the failed miracle of the recently deceased Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian superstar. According to the abbot, a desperate father had besought Bernard's help for his ailing boy, but when Bernard arrived at the man's abode, the boy was already dead. The saint dramatically prostrated himself on the boy's body in prayer. By the way, Saint Benedict did this, so it's not just Bernard's idea. When he arose, however, the boy just lay there, still dead. At this point, Walter could not resist quipping, then he must be a most unlucky of monks. I have heard before now of a monk throwing himself upon a boy, but always when the monk got up, the boy got up promptly too. The abbot blushed in mortification, while the others at the king's table chuckled. If boys presented such a problem, one wonders why the monastic orders didn't get rid of them altogether. This is precisely what the so-called new orders of the late 11th and 12th century are believed to have done, though they never actually say precisely that this is a motive. In fact, the situation is more complicated. The Cistercians allegedly eschewed child oblation, instead requiring adult recruitment. But the rather murky origins of the Cistercian order veers away from this crisp textbook account. Although founded in 1098, the earliest documents responsible for representing and shaping the order's ethos emerged incrementally over the course of the 12th century. The earliest statute addressing the question of age, traditionally dated at 1134, was probably drafted sometime later. And it stipulated that a novice must have completed his 15th year before entering the order. Very soon, chronological age proved an insufficient standard. In 1154, the General Chapter, which was the order's administrative arm that met annually, would further ordain that, quote, if any novice of 15 or more has a face or an entire body that casts suspicion on his age, end of quote, he could be expelled by the abbot of Citeaux, who presided over the entire order during one of his visitations. Without explicitly acknowledging the perilous temptation associated with youthful appearance, the statute of 1154 comes close. In 1157, the age was raised to 18. And it was also ordained that, quote, no one should be made abbot with an excessively young or boyish face. Brethren were also expected to keep one another at arm's length. In 1182, the custom whereby the abbot received a kiss when he returned from travel was roundly condemned as indecent. When a statute explicitly banning sexual infractions finally made an appearance in 1189, its terms are suggestive, quote, if anyone is apprehended in manifest contagion of the flesh, he should be absolutely expelled from that house from which he sinned, never to return there, according to the custom preserved by our holy fathers thus far. The canon seems to imply that the sin was committed within the monastic precincts, which might argue for a same-sex component. Although this canon may well be the custom of the founding fathers, as is claimed, and would be repeated after 1189, this is nevertheless its first formal appearance. Actual punishments for what were possibly sexual infractions begin to make an appearance only in the 13th century, though the exact nature of the offenses is not always clear. What, for example, are we to make of the Thuringian monk who was accused of, quote, certain filthy and unheard of things, not fit to be said or related, or the Hungarian abbot deposed for his shameless dissolution, the sole explicit charge against him being that he struck the naked buttocks of certain monks with his bare hand. But it is only in 1220, when a lay brother was ejected from his monastery for an unspeakable vice, and that of course has become the current euphemism by then, that we can be relatively certain that the offense being addressed involved same-sex activity. The offending lay brother was sent to another community where he was imprisoned. The next year, it was ordained that anyone convicted of the sodomitical vice should be expelled from the order, never to be readmitted. Monastic authorities found it difficult to stick to this resolve, however. 3 years later, an addendum was added, allowing someone convicted of sodomy, but on the verge of death, to be admitted to the infirmary of the poor, but expelled in the event that he recovered. As the danger of same-sex relations became more explicit, the illicit introduction of minors was presented in increasingly ominous terms. In 1201, the non-compliance of a number of houses on the matter of age was cited as giving rise to, quote, the gravest scandals. As a result, a monastic superior who knowingly accepted underage novices suffered irreversible deposition. The following year, however, the general chapter mitigated this harsh decree. It was now ordained that any prior or sub-prior responsible for admitting an underage novice should be moved to another house, never to return. Either way, the original edict and the more forgiving version would have both the effect of separating the prior or the sub-prior from whatever underage novice he illicitly admitted, suggesting that the transgression was linked to an objectionable partiality on the part of the monastic official. Clearly, such measures proved insufficient. A ruling of 1231 made it clear that the admission of an underage monk would no longer be tolerated as a fait accompli, and that the original rule of expulsion must be enforced. First, however, it must be ascertained that the expulsion of such an individual would serve, quote, the utility and honor of the order. So before leaving, the child must be subjected to a kind of testing that is compared with the proving of spirits, if they are of God. That's from 1 John 4. In other words, an approximation of the process for distinguishing divine and diabolical inspiration must be applied to the boy himself. In a scandal-averse religious climate, such measures made sense. A child who was rejected from the monastery could be a dangerous variable. Around the same time that the new orders were emerging, Cluny was likewise attempting to introduce strictures regarding age. Abbot Peter the Venerable attempted to raise the bar for investing a monk to the age of 20. Although this initiative failed and Cluny continued oblation until the late 13th century, Peter's rationale is noteworthy, and he's one of the few people who actually gives rationale for the different constitutions. The reason behind this institute was the ill-considered and excessively hasty way of accepting children who, before they have anything of rational intelligence, are dressed in the garb of sacred religion and mixed with others. Everyone is disturbed by their inept childishness, and as I am quiet about certain things, I sum up many things briefly, and they, the children, advance practically nothing by early profession themselves and impede the religious dedication of others not a little, and indeed sometimes excessively, end of quote. Admittedly, this statute mostly addresses the disruptive presence of children, yet Peter's resolve, quote, to be quiet about certain things also suggests that boys were a source of sexual scandal, and this is corroborated elsewhere. Bernard of Cluny's incendiary work on the contempt for the world maintains that, quote, the flame and the ardor of Sodom are wickedly common. No one conceals or represses this wickedness. Also, the filth of Sodom is openly seen. Countless Ganymedes are swarming. Oh, shame, castles and towns are full of this filthy plague. Indeed, sacristies are no less full, end of quote. Not only was Bernard a monk at Cluny during Peter the Venerable's abbacy, but the poem in question was dedicated to the abbot. Indeed, an anecdote from Peter the Venerable's miracle collection likewise attests to the ubiquity of clerical pederasty. A half-dozing monk listened as demons compare notes about their varying degrees of success in the instigation of sin. A vulture-shaped demon, so fat he can hardly stand, complains that he had made no headway with the Cluniac monks due to their extensive prayers and liberal sprinklings of holy water. But his comrades had spent their time more productively. One seemingly routine triumph occurred. Quote, going through a certain monastery, we brought it about that the master of the school committed fornication with one of the boys, end of quote. At this point, another demon notices the onlooking monk and rebukes the hitherto unsuccessful vulture demon. But what's your business, you idler? Stand up and at least cut off the leg of that monk, who extends it beyond the bed in a disorderly fashion, end of quote. The fornication between a teacher and a student at a monastic school seems no more remarkable than the unruly postures of a sleeping monk. Despite such suggestive prompts, it is not until 1292 that the general chapter at Cluny saw fit to address the question of sodomy directly in the context of a list of reasons for excommunication. The statute in question indicted, quote, whoever imposes the sin against nature through malice on his brother. Again, in 1301, under Abbot Bertrand I, the same sanction was issued as an official statute. Quote, we excommunicate all those who would inflict the vice against nature on his brother through malice. And we understand malice by the fact that he, meaning the one who it's being inflicted on, does not wish to follow what the abuser inflicted, or by the fact that the accuser failed to prove the abuse. Clearly, rape was an ongoing problem in monastic communities. The big difference seems to be that the victim is not punished, presumably because he was somewhat older than we saw in a Carolingian context. Yet, while the introduction of a statute presumably pointed to a problem, it was rarely acted upon. This becomes apparent from the various visitations to Cluniac priories that began in the 13th century. Between the years 1259 and 1408, instances of heterosexual infractions abound. There are only 4 cases in which a monk was openly accused of sodomy. 2 of these cases are almost certainly slander, people trying to get rid of their abbot. Prior. One probably involved sodomy with a woman, but it is only the 4th case, the most detailed of them all, that we can say with any real assurance is probably an instance of same-sex relation, and that's what's being stigmatized. The case occurred in 1303 in the Swiss priory of St. Victor, at which the flamboyant sub-prior, Brother Jordan, who was defamed for, quote, practicing the vice against nature. Jordan did nothing to conceal his sexual proclivities, apparently. He would repeatedly kiss two brothers in particular, both inside and outside the church, quote, holding their vile parts and doing other unchaste things. Nor was his behavior limited to the priory, but also enacted in the city of Geneva, where he was defamed, quote, among good and serious men of the said vice. Jordan would end his public necking sessions with his boisterous, not to mention ominous comment that he and his companions should exercise that vice on the other monks, one at a time, over and over. He assured his acolytes that it was a greater sin to know women than men, adding the practical consideration that males who sinned together could always absolve one another. For an entire winter, Jordan kept his confreres awake, forcing them to participate in a sing-along of secular tunes. When not keeping them awake with singing, Jordan found other ways to bother them. By night, he was wont to uncover his sleeping confreres, stroking their backs and their legs. Before the monks had even finished their testimony, Jordan had fled the monastery, ignoring the prior's insistence that he stay. But Jordan's hasty departure was doubtless motivated by the fact that he recognized one of the visitors. When Brother P. de Broussonnet revealed that he had encountered Jordan at an earlier visitation, he was asked if he could shed any light on the present defamation case. Quote, he responded that in his visitation to Germany a good 3 years before, he found him, Brother Jordan, in a priory called Thierenbach, where he dwelt with the prior, and that the Brother Jordan ensnared a certain youth with many words and made him sleep with him in his bed, totally nude, saying to the youth that if he acquiesced to his words and deed, he would give him a good gown and certain other things. The youth responded, asking what he wished to do to him. The aforesaid Jordan said that he wished to know him carnally in 2 ways and began kissing and embracing him. The youth fled almost naked and reported those things to the prior and the household. In fact, the visitor said to the prior that he should send Jordan to the next general chapter to be disciplined. But Jordan did not come to the chapter, end of quote. And in the record, the word nude is underlined. There's no doubt that the case is exceptional, both in the fact that Jordan's offense is not only named, but that his behavior is described in such detail. Even so, there are some predictable patterns which further illumine why, in all probability, most cases of clerical and especially monastic sodomy never come to light, as well as why this one did. After the incident at Thierenbach, Jordan ignored the summons to Cluny that pertained to the reserved sin of sodomy. It could only be absolved by the abbot. Instead, he pursued a tried and true strategy applied to other kinds of sexual offenses, as well as any kind of scandal. He moved. Although Jordan made the move on his own initiative, apparently, it was a familiar clerical strategy. This is what scholastic authority Henry of Ghent had advised the superior, who was made aware through confession that a pastor was corrupt. It was also a tried and true method amongst the Cluniacs. Hugh V had mandated that, quote, if anyone were to be plagued by scandal in one place, he should be transferred to another place and a more reputable person be substituted to that place, end of quote. This line of action was especially germane in instances of heterosexual incontinence, since it separated the monk from the female source of sin. In Jordan's case, his illicit move from Basel to France not only put about 150 miles between him and the scene of the crime, but the 2 priories were also in 2 different Cluniac provinces, which would generally be subject to different visitors. Sorry, in this case, he wasn't so lucky, the same visitor. A Cluniac monk was not authorized to travel without a letter from his prior. So perhaps the prior wrote a letter introducing Jordan to the prior of St. Victor's and asking that he be received as a monk in that house. Or maybe Jordan took it upon himself to steal the seal or borrow it and forge such a letter. Of course, such a request was against the rules. A statute of 1200 chastised priors for the ease with which they sent difficult monks to different houses just to get rid of them. In 1277, moreover, it was declared that such movements were forbidden without the permission of the abbot of Cluny or one of his representatives, and that any house to which a monk was illicitly sent should not receive him. But the situation of Jordan is living proof that the statutes were not always followed. Besides, Jordan had qualities that may well have recommended him to the monastery on the receiving end. First and foremost was his flair for music. It seems very likely that someone who was so intent on keeping his brethren awake with secular ditties also had a good voice. Cluny was famous for its liturgy, which could occupy as much as 8 hours of a monk's day. Masses, particularly masses for the dead, had traditionally been an important source of revenue for Cluny. Furthermore, Jordan's glib remarks that sacerdotal lovers had the advantage of being able to absolve one another suggest he was already ordained to the priesthood, which would increase his value to the community. The priory of St. Victor's may have been in need of sacerdotal support. Only 6 of St. Victor's 12 monks were priests. If there were only 5 priests when Jordan arrived, by Cluniac levels, that's quite low, and he would have been welcome. And Jordan clearly had the ability to ingratiate himself. In 3 years, he had risen from being a mere newcomer with a flair for music to the sub-prior. But familiarity breeds contempt. If Jordan at one time seemed like a godsend, his flagrant behavior, which may have been appropriate to a roving gang of Galliards, was out of step with a 13th century Cluniac priory in Geneva. Although Jordan's evening pranks may have been titillating at first, when word of his hijinks, quote, spread among good and serious men in secular society, his fate was sealed. And this is the other way in which this case is representative. The charge of sodomy is occasionally used to get rid of a hated confrere, but it seems likely that the charge of sodomy is only formally made and seriously pursued by monastic authorities when a situation is either known or threatens to become known to secular society. Jordan created a scandal in Germany when he attempted to seduce a secular youth, barely escaping imprisonment. St. Victor's gave him a new start. The fact that he was now focusing his libidinal interest on his confreres, at least initially, rather than the boys in town, suggests he was reaping the benefits of a larger community than his earlier one, where in fact it was only him and the prior. And that's not unusual that there can be a Cluniac priory with only 2 monks, but they must have been quite close, which is why I sort of think that the prior might have helped him escape. Anyways, at St. Victor's, 5 of his confreres were not priests and were thus in all probability under 20, but word of his objectionable conduct traveled outside the cloister. This meant that he had become a distinct liability for St. Victor's and was ripe for denunciation at the next visitation. Again, it should be reiterated that the case of Brother Jordan was very much the exception. Sodomy charges may have been mobilized to destroy another monk's reputation, but they were hardly, if ever, used primarily to stop a monk's sexual predation on boys. Such cases were only pursued if they created a scandal in the secular world. The seeming nonchalance toward pederasty is striking when compared to cases involving sexual relations with women, which were vigorously prosecuted. From a theoretical standpoint, same-sex relations in any form were considered more sinful and hence more scandalous, and this would justify a tactical concealment for public good so that public wouldn't be scandalized. From an institutional standpoint, however, such relations were much less of a threat than comparable relations with females, since wives and concubines and their offspring not only represented an economic drain on ecclesiastical property, but also tended to divide loyalties. This contention flies in the face of the more traditional view that the church was a defender of children, condemning pederasty as early as the 4th century at the Council of Elvira. But at the time of this council, pederasty was the only acceptable form of same-sex relations between males. It was illegal for an older man to play the passive role, and he could be fined. The prime motivation behind such sanctions was never the welfare of children. What was really being condemned was same-sex relations. Pederasty just happened to be the form that these relations assumed and would continue to assume. The monastic culture of pederasty was facilitated by the opportunistic practice of blaming the victim. pioneered by the church fathers. And actually, I was very happy that Lynda showed that slide from Corvée, because that slide is, people have reconstructed it, say that it would have been above the boys' choir. So the boys were being stigmatized as sirens, again, blaming the victim. It's also ubiquitous throughout clerical culture. We find this tendency to blame the victim covertly in the hagiographical tradition of Saint Euphrosyne, a pious maiden whom circumstances compelled to assume the persona of a monk. Her youthful good looks raised such unbridled desire in her fellow monks that the abbot was forced to imprison her for life. And we find it overtly in an anonymous 13th century poem, which protests that, quote, "The morals of the young are not corrupted in the cloister. Often the older brothers are molested by them. Anyone who defends the young and does not reprove them is frequently duped and falls into a trap. Any reader who dismisses such sentiments as simply satire is simply being naive." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dyan. Thank you so much, Lynda. Those were both wonderful and rich papers. And we have about 20 minutes at our disposal. I would like first to give the very socially distanced people present on the screen the opportunity to comment on either of the papers or ask any questions, and our very socially distanced floor is open. I do have also one set of questions that have come in via email, and we can move on to those.
I just wanted to thank you both for these lovely papers. Well, I mean, I don't know whether lovely is really the word, because you know we've got misogyny, we've got child abuse. I mean, but you know, as I said in my plenary, you know, I wish that, you know, I could offer a more pleasant picture also, but not everything in the Middle Ages is to be celebrated. Nevertheless, they were lovely papers in that they are fascinating and thought-provoking, and I would like to hear the questions from the rest of the audience.
Okay, well, I have, first of all, 2 questions from Manu Radhakrishnan, one for Lynda, one for Dyan. So let's start with Lynda, and he asks, are there texts that talk about what the censor stands for? What do bestiaries prior to the Cologne Sacramentary say about mermaids and mermen, assuming that the genre predates the Sacramentary?
Yeah, actually the censor is from Alamarius of Metz in his long discussion of the liturgy. He describes it as a stand-in for Christ's body because he's purifying the earth. So in a way, I think that was kind of interesting because Christ is not in that initial folio that's fairly famous, but clearly the exegetes could read him in the form of a liturgical object, which I love the stuff that's being done in our Byzantine and Syriac late ancient, where they've already discovered all the stuff about how holy people function as objects. It seems like there's probably more of that in the Carolingian world. I forgot the second part of that.
It was, what do bestiaries prior to the Cologne Sacramentary say about mermaids and mermen, assuming that the genre predates the Sacramentary?
Right. I mean, I think there's that very famous Book of Monsters from about the 8th century. 8th century appears to be a turning point for the history of mermaids. That is, they take on the persona of these classicizing sirens. So this Cologne is an early representative, though there's another one in a bestiary from the Anglo-Saxon world, I believe, from the 8th century. So, but you're right in that it's a fascinating text because it's shifting all kinds of things. It's shifting the liturgy from the Merovingian world to the Carolingian world, and it's shifting these classicizing references. I mean, it's fantastic. And I wouldn't say I've memorized the whole thing, but I'm getting close.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I noted just how various the forms of mermaids are physically, which is striking given the degree to which mermaids are conventionalized in later periods. Okay, the Manu's question for Dyan. How does the vocabulary for the ages of man overlap with child oblacy? What age did oblates become monks? Are they adolescentes, juvenes, or infantes?
Well, in the Benedictine rule, he uses the word infants and puer interchangeably. So there's a certain amount of flexibility there, but generally people are not going to be called puer after 14. And juvenes can go on as long as 28. So it's a very long, or adolescents too. These are long, sort of not very well defined periods. But if you have puer or infants, you're pretty sure you're talking about, well, infants for sure would be definitely probably, under 10. So oblation, people can be given, what was the rest of the question about oblation?
Oh, let me go back to it. Okay, how does the vocabulary for the ages of man overlap with child oblacy? And at what age did oblates become monks?
Oh, I think that for a life profession, it has to be 16. I don't think, but these things are also variable, as is the ordination of the priest, depending on, I don't know, the monastery and stuff like that. But I think 16. But the thing about the oblate, is the sad story of Gottschalk of Orbay will show, is, that one view of monasticism is that really assuming the habit is like taking life vows, and that a child cannot leave if given as an oblate by his parents. Gottschalk of Orbay, who tried very hard to leave, was imprisoned by his abbot. And so, they didn't have, like life vows wouldn't have had sort of the same significance of, I'm really committing to this life, because in Benedictine monasticism, if your parents gave you, it was very hard to get out. So I don't know, does that answer that question? I'm not sure. Can you, I guess we can't really check.
No, yeah.
Okay.
I'm here. Okay, I have a comment on the session from Grover's Inn, who said that it was terrific, and a question for Lynda. And he writes, fascinating paper. Among the images of fish, I note one crushing a cross in his mouth, folio 22.
Oh, wow.
Comment more on this image and perhaps others, any relation to Christ as a fishhook? That's
very nice.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, well, there's been ways of, I'm a big fan of Michael Camille's work on monstrous mouths and manuscripts, and certainly all that biting, chewing, and snapping has been interpreted to be monks masticating on the word. So, you could read it that way, but if you're trying to get the siren's angle in there as a kind of shadowing of other routes people may have taken to get to these religious ideas, I kind of like the idea of biting down midway on that cross. That works for me. Very nice.
Okay, so thank you, Grover. And thank you, Lynda. I don't seem to have any more questions coming into my email, but looks like Ruth has one. You're muted.
I'll ask okay, I think am I unmuted now? Yeah, okay. So I had questions for both Dyan and Lynda. I'll ask Lynda first. I was very interested in the connection of salt with fertility, given that salting a field is what you do to make it infertile. And I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about that.
Well, that's probably a confluence of a whole series of things, including, of course, the priestly preoccupation with that story of Elisha, whom probably because of some sort of religious theory of opposites, takes salt and makes water, fecund, probably because it's operating in a structural opposition, if that makes sense. But also, you know, part of that is that ancient Christian rite of salt in the mouth of the baptized. I think there's a liturgical background there that's very strong with salt. But then for fecundity, you know, the siren is Venus's spawn. She's a spawn of the salty sea. And there's a kind of perverse fecundity there. So again, there are all these weird opposites, I would say.
Yeah, I just also wanted to add one thing, or I guess add a little question on to Grover's question about the fish imagery, because I was just thinking that sounded familiar to me, and I just looked it up, and it's in a text. So this is attributed in the PL to Rabanus Maurus. You probably know better than I whether that's a valid attribution or not, but it is referring to the genealogy of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew as a baited hook, which is tossed by God into the sea of the world. And the names in the genealogy are the rope that are attached to the hook, which is Christ, and they're trying to catch people. I mean, is that a common metaphor in the Carolingian period?
You know, I'd have to look it up in the Carolingian. I know it becomes later because I have colleagues in art history. Certainly I've looked at that, but I'm guessing it's probably there, but that's I should go look for hooks. It's all over Hebrew scripture. I mean, hooks and nets and traps. So it can't possibly not be there.
Mm-hmm. Also, doesn't the devil, it wasn't an old image for the devil getting caught on a hook and stuff like that? So yeah, they like hooks. But I have a question for Lynda too. Oh, Ruth, am I interrupting you? Yes.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, am I the only person who thinks that these mermaids look incredibly phallic? And then with the salt and the water, etc. Like, I mean, it seems like an alternate inseminating world or something.
I think, well, that's what I'm saying. It's based upon what the priests are doing, and everything they're doing are in opposition, right? You have to structurally exercise before you can purify. And so I don't think that's crazy at all. She's clearly some sort of very threatening figure. It would make more sense that it's phallic. Why not?
Shifting kind of thing, because I mean the genitalia aren't fixed, but shape of her and fish generally,
And sort of slithering through I love the manuscript as water, right?
Those are some great images, I gotta say.
That's a stunning text, But I'm interested in it for its religious structural whole. I mean, I'm not an art historian, I know that. But it seems to me that the images are doing a lot more than one might think. That's all.
No, that's for sure.
It's really interesting that you use the word slithering, because I was thinking of how snake-like the mermaids were. I mean, much, or eel-like maybe. I mean, and it reminded me, I mean, this is late medieval, but the serpent in the Garden of Eden being depicted with a woman's head.
I think that's definitely kind of playing out in this, especially with that Carolingian poetry that's very strong on this idea of Eve. Mary is the new Eve, and then there's this serpentine figure that's coming into these texts. So that makes perfect sense to me.
I have another question.
I got one for you.
All right. Okay. My next question is: do you ever find things similar things to try and control the other elements besides water?
Well, the Cologne Sacramentary has got all kinds of stuff about weather. I mean, it's such a fantastic text. So they're certainly trying to control elemental aspects of the universe in the text. But no, I haven't actually looked for that yet. I've been very fixated on, well, Jesus is in this paper. I guess Christ is more in the paper. He's the salt, I think. But I've been kind of focused on him. But now I'm thinking, wow, there's a lot more you could do here.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
So I had a question for Dyan, which is as I talked about in novels where the punishment for the younger or the more vulnerable party is considerably less than for the active party. Is that a chronological shift from sort of blaming the victim to allowing some innocence, or is it a monastic versus secular difference?
Well, I think there's a shift in monasticism. We can see it in Kuhn, where it says, you know, if you try and rape someone from malice. But at that point, you know, late 13th, early 14th century, we didn't have oblates, at least allegedly. There were always little boys around, okay? The boys' choirs, there were servants, there were a lot of people to rape if you wanted to. But, you know, we would probably be talking about kids who were over 16. And then I think that some of the things that they feared about little boys and being formed and stuff like that, you know, wouldn't pertain as much, you know, that the adultness of the victim might be more respected, though it would still fit in with the hierarchical situation. I mean, these are opportunistic expressions of, I don't even know if you can call it sexuality, but rape, you know, I don't know. So I think they were still going for the youngest, but because the youngest in a Cluniac context would be considered, you know, a mature person relatively, that might have made them more sympathetic.
I have a few more questions and comments from the wider world. Grover's in response to Lynda's response to, I think to his question, he writes, it's in Gregory the Great, fish is, no, well, there are typos, I'm having trouble here. I think Christ is the fishhook that catches Leviathan.
Great.
Also, if I remember, Christ is the fishhook in an image by Herod of Landesberg. Then a question from Constant News for Dyan. A great paper. Apologies, I came in late. It's 6 a.m. in Melbourne. Constant dedicated. Are you familiar with the case of Roger, Archbishop of York, accused of having a boy he had murdered molested?
Walter, yeah.
Okay. John of Salisbury reports the event, but also writes a letter of apology on behalf of Roger.
Yeah, I know about it, and actually I think it's a very interesting case because it really does show kind of, perhaps especially in England, Ruth could speak more to that, but secular outrage over this abuse of the boy, because John of Salisbury's letter actually says that afterwards, when Walter blabbed, he eventually had him executed or something like that, you know. And there's a wonderful article by this in, is it in Gender in History? But anyways, by Andrew Miller, who writes about this case. But it really is a fascinating case where you see a mob violence, and the mob, you know, attacks the bishop and interestingly slashes his kappa so that his buttocks would be exposed. And Andrew speculates that that was that the reason that he was assaulted in this way was because of what had happened to Walter.
Okay. And looking at the clock, I guess one last question from John Terry, who writes, hopefully this gets in under the wire, a question for Lynda. My connection was lost a couple of times, so perhaps you covered this. Apologies. If so, how interested were commentators from the period in the duality of salt as both a preservative and a preventer of fertility? So I think we've touched a bit on that.
Yeah, maybe a little bit, but that's a very John Terry way of framing that. Yeah, I think I talked a little bit about what I know about the sort of rituals of opposites, so that it can be fertility, but also quite the opposite. Well, I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at more exegetical texts, probably. That's a good question.
Okay, and okay, we have 1 minute to go. Question from Teresa Gross Diaz for Dyan. Did you say the Visigothic rule was more protective of children? Do you see more protection of children in secular laws? Thanks for a great but depressing paper.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think actually Visigoths are a special case. I know John Boswell said that, you know, there are laws that actually put sodomites to death in Visigothic law, but actually this seems to dovetail with the kind of treatment the Fructuosus of Braga saw. So I think that for whatever reason, church and state in the Visigothic world were somehow united on this issue. So.
Okay, well, it is now 3:30 here where I sit in Philadelphia, and God only knows what time it is in Melbourne and in the time zones of everybody else. But I really want to thank the panelists for really superb papers. I want to thank Ruth for providing the occasion for these superb papers and for so much more. And again, for everybody who made this online session, including my email interlocutors, such a great success. I repeat, we would all rather have been there in person, but this was all a pretty good second best. So thank you all.